before the polio vaccine, before IVF, before gene mapping. There was a woman whose name most people still don't know: Henrietta Lacks. In 1951, she was a young black mother of 5, dying from cervical cancer in a segregated hospital in Baltimore. Doctors took a tissue sample from her tumor without asking. That sample became the first human cells to survive and multiply outside the body. They called them HeLa cells. They went on to revolutionize medicine, and they're still alive today. But Henrietta, she was buried in an unmarked grave, and her family remained in the dark for decades, watching the world heal from cells taken from a woman they loved, but who was never given a choice. This is not just a story about science. It's a story about ethics, consent, race, and what we value when no one's watching. In this episode, we explore how one woman's body reshaped modern medicine, and why we're only now learning her name. Chapter 1: A Life Before the Lab: Who Henrietta Lacks Really Was. Long before her cells changed the course of medicine, Henrietta Lacks was simply a woman trying to live, love, and survive. Born in 1920 in Roanoke, Virginia, Henrietta was raised in a world that didn't see her potential because she was black, poor, and female. After her mother died when Henrietta was just 4, she was sent to live with her grandfather in a log cabin that had once been a slave quarters. She grew up working in tobacco fields like many in her family, quietly and without complaint. She wasn't a scientist. She didn't ask to be part of history. She just wanted to live. But in early 1951, Henrietta felt something was wrong. She went to Johns Hopkins, the only hospital that treated black patients at the time, and was diagnosed with cervical cancer. The tumor was aggressive. The treatments were crude. Radiation therapy burned her from the inside out. And during one of her treatments, a doctor sliced a sample of her tumor without telling her, not to cure her, to study her. That small act, routine, unregulated, and devastating, marked the moment Henrietta's body was split in two. There was the living woman dying in a segregated ward, and there were her cells, thriving in a lab, soon to become immortal. But before the world renamed her HeLa, Henrietta was a mother, a friend, a churchgoer. She loved to dance. She painted her nails deep red. She had a laugh her family said you could feel in your bones. She had dreams that stopped the day science kept going without her. This is where the story so often begins, cells in a petri dish, but it should begin here, with a woman who had no idea her body was being harvested, who would never know her cells would help map genes, test cancer drugs, and study HIV. She didn't sign a form. She didn't give consent. She didn't live to hear her name honored. And yet, her cells outlived her. They multiplied endlessly. They went to space. They powered Nobel Prizes. The cost? She died at 31, and her family would live for decades in poverty without health insurance, while pharmaceutical companies built empires on her biology. Before the textbooks, the research, the global impact, there was just Henrietta, a woman trying to live a quiet life before science took it and didn't look back. Chapter 2: The Birth of HeLa. How one sample rewrote medical history. In early 1951, within the walls of Johns Hopkins Hospital, Henrietta Lacks underwent treatment for cervical cancer. She was 31 years old, a black mother of 5, already suffering, without knowing the history being quietly written in the background. During one of her treatments, a white physician named Dr. George Gay received a sample of her tumor. It was a common practice at the time, especially in segregated wards, to take cells without patient knowledge or consent. In fact, it wasn't even considered unethical by the medical standards of the day. Patients, especially black patients, were often treated as sources of material, not as full participants in their own health care. The cells from Henrietta's tumor did something no other human cells had ever done in a lab. They lived. Not only did they live, they multiplied, rapidly, indefinitely. They didn't die after a few divisions, like every other human cell line ever tested. Henrietta's cells grew so fast and so reliably that they were labeled immortal. Dr. Gay named them HeLa, using the first two letters of Henrietta's first and last name. But the woman herself was anonymized. She wasn't credited. Her family wasn't told. And while her body weakened from radiation and pain, her cells were already being distributed around the world. HeLa cells became a scientific revolution. They enabled Jonas Salk to develop the polio vaccine. They helped scientists understand cancer, study the effects of radiation, and test the safety of new drugs. They were cloned, sent into space, exposed to nuclear fallout, and used to unlock the secrets of virology, immunology, and genetics. They were the first human cells ever commercially mass-produced, and all of it began with a woman who had no idea she was being studied. The significance of HeLa cannot be overstated. These cells laid the foundation for modern biomedical research. They were instrumental in mapping the human genome. They were part of the research that led to in vitro fertilization, cancer therapies, and treatments for Parkinson's disease. Entire fields of medicine advanced because of them. But the question looms large: at what cost? Henrietta's cells were sold, profited from, patented, and shared by research institutions and pharmaceutical companies. Yet her name remained hidden for decades. Her body, her family, and her story were forgotten, even as the world built scientific empires from her biology. This chapter of her life isn't just about biology. It's about the deep injustice of being used without consent. It's about how the quest for healing can sometimes obscure the humanity of those who make it possible. Henrietta didn't volunteer to become a cornerstone of science. She didn't sign a form or give permission. She went in for help. She was in pain. She was a patient. And without knowing it, she became one of the most important figures in the history of medicine. Her cells never stopped dividing, and neither did the moral questions they raised. Chapter 3. A Family in the Dark. The Cost of Scientific Progress. While the world celebrated the scientific breakthrough of HeLa cells, the woman they came from lay in her hospital bed, unaware, in pain, and dying. Henrietta Lacks passed away on October 4, 1951, at the age of 31. Her cancer had spread with brutal speed, her final days spent in agony in a segregated ward. There was no funeral befitting a scientific hero, no public acknowledgement, no monument, just a burial in an unmarked grave in Clover, Virginia. And while her cells began their journey, crossing continents, rocketing into space, fueling experiments, her family was left in darkness. They had no idea what had been taken from them. No one informed them that part of Henrietta was still alive in laboratories around the world. Her husband, her children. They buried a mother and a wife, never knowing her biology had become immortal. For decades, the Lacks family lived in poverty. Some worked as laborers, others in kitchens, or struggling to find work at all. They couldn't afford health insurance. Meanwhile, HeLa cells were becoming a billion-dollar industry. Pharmaceutical companies used them to test drugs. Researchers studied them to understand viruses, cancer, and the effects of radiation. Patents were filed, profits soared. The contradiction was staggering. Henrietta's DNA transformed medicine, yet her children couldn't afford a checkup. Her cells cured diseases, but her family battled silence and neglect. When her daughter Deborah finally learned the truth decades later, she was devastated, not just by what was taken, but by what was hidden. If our mother's cells done so much for medicine, she asked, how come her family can't afford to see no doctors? It was a question science didn't want to answer. The injustice wasn't just the lack of consent, it was the complete erasure of Henrietta's humanity. She had become a sample code, a label, HeLa. The world forgot the woman behind the cells. This chapter of the story is about power and the cost of progress, about how even the noblest pursuits, curing disease, extending life, can become ethically hollow if they leave people behind, especially the very people they claim to serve. Henrietta's case is now taught in medical ethics classes around the world. She is the reason patients sign consent forms, the reason bioethics is now a field of study. But these honors came late, after decades of silence, after her family demanded to be seen. HeLa cells became immortal, but they were never free. And the price of that immortality was paid not just by Henrietta, but by every generation that came after her. Silenced, overlooked, until finally they found their voice. This isn't just a story about science. It's a story about ownership, about how a single act, done without consent, can echo through generations, and how truth, even when delayed, demands to be told. Chapter 4: Recognition, Resistance, and the Fight for Justice. For more than 20 years, Henrietta Lacks' name remained a secret. The world knew her only as HeLa, a label, not a person. It wasn't until the 1970s that her identity was revealed publicly, not by transparency or intention, but by accident. Researchers had begun sending HeLa samples across laboratories globally, but contamination from these aggressive cells created problems for other cell lines. Scientists needed to trace the origin. So they reached out to the Lacks family. That's when the truth hit. Henrietta's children were contacted not with apology, but with curiosity. Researchers wanted blood samples to further their studies. They didn't explain that their mother's cells had been alive and multiplying for decades. They didn't explain what HeLa meant. They didn't even ask if the family consented to being part of the process. To the Lacks family, it felt like a second betrayal. They learned, all at once, that their mother's cells had become immortal, that they'd traveled the world, that they'd helped develop countless medical advances, while the family itself lived paycheck to paycheck, often without access to basic health care. It was a harsh paradox. Their mother's cells helped others live longer, while they struggled to survive. Henrietta's daughter, Deborah, was especially shaken. She had grown up with questions, with gaps in the story of who her mother really was. The sudden flood of attention only deepened the grief. "Can you tell me," she once asked a journalist, "why my mother's blood is still living when she's been dead so long?" For years, the family pushed back, not against science, but against erasure. They weren't asking for money. They wanted acknowledgement, dignity, truth. Their fight sparked a broader national conversation about bioethics and consent, especially in communities of color, where distrust in medical institutions has deep historical roots. In 2013, after years of advocacy, the National Institutes of Health, NIH, finally took action. They reached an agreement with the Lacks family. Researchers would need permission from a specially formed committee, including Lacks family members, before using Henrietta's genetic information. It was a small step, but symbolically enormous. That same year, a statue of Henrietta was erected in her honor. Her face, long hidden, began to appear in textbooks, museums, and university lectures. Oprah Winfrey portrayed her daughter in a film adaptation of the immortal life of Henrietta Lacks, bringing even more public attention to the story. But justice for the Lacks family remains complicated. There has never been financial restitution equal to the value Henrietta's cells generated. HeLa has been used in more than 75,000 studies. It has helped countless patients. It has made millions for biotech companies. Yet her descendants still live in economic precarity. Recognition matters. So does representation, but so does reparation. The resistance continues, not just from the Lacks family, but from advocates worldwide who believe that medical progress must include ethical accountability. Henrietta's story is no longer just a case study. It's a movement, a reminder that behind every sample, every study, every statistic, there's a human being with a name, a story, a voice, and that voice is no longer silent. Chapter 5, Legacy: How Henrietta Lacks Reframed Science and Ethics Forever. Henrietta Lacks never lived to see what her cells became. but the world she unknowingly helped build. Through pain, through loss, through violation, has touched every corner of modern medicine. Her cells have been used in developing the polio vaccine, in cancer research, in AIDS treatments, in the study of chromosomes, cloning, and the effects of radiation. HeLa cells were the first human cells sent to space. They've been involved in everything from drug trials to COVID-19 research. Yet her legacy goes far beyond science. Henrietta Lacks rewrote the rules of medical ethics without ever knowing she had entered the arena. Today, she's honored in museums, textbooks, and research institutions. Statues have been raised, buildings named, conferences opened in her memory. In 2021, 70 years after her cells were first harvested, the World Health Organization honored her as a global symbol of injustice in medical research. The message was clear: progress built on silence is not progress at all. Her name is now spoken with reverence, but reverence is not enough. Because the real transformation, the one Henrietta Lacks sparked, was not just scientific, it was human. Her story changed how we think about consent, about dignity, about who gets to participate in their own medical journey. It forced the medical establishment to ask questions it had long ignored. Who owns biological material once it leaves the body? What rights do patients have to their own cells? How do race, class, and power shape the so-called neutrality of science? Henrietta's life exposed the illusion that research is value-free. She proved that every lab sample has a backstory, every breakthrough a cost. Her family's decades-long battle for recognition became a larger symbol of resistance, not against medicine itself, but against the way it has too often operated in shadows, taking from the vulnerable without asking, extracting in the name of progress. Now, Henrietta's great-grandchildren speak on panels. Her descendants serve on NIH boards. Her name is invoked in legal debates, ethical reforms, and education. She has become both a warning and an aspiration. A warning about what happens when we dehumanize in the pursuit of discovery, and an aspiration for what science can become when it centers transparency, respect, and justice. And still, her cells continue to divide, still alive in labs across the world, still enabling healing, still defying time. Henrietta Lacks may have been denied a choice, but she was never voiceless, not really. Her voice lives in the very structure of medicine today. In every informed consent form, in every conversation about ethics, in every question about justice, and most importantly, in every patient who now gets to say, "Yes, I understand, I choose." Henrietta Lacks was never asked, not for her tissue, not for her story, not for her legacy, and yet, she gave the world life, polio vaccines, cancer therapies, breakthroughs in fertility, genetics, and space medicine. Her cells became immortal. Her name nearly didn't. But this is where history changes, when we choose to say her name out loud. Henrietta Lacks, a Black woman from Virginia, a mother, a daughter, a fighter, who went into a hospital for care and became the backbone of modern science. She didn't write scientific papers. She didn't wear a lab coat. She didn't profit from what was taken, but in every medical textbook that mentions HeLa, in every ethical form that now demands informed consent, in every patient who benefits from a treatment once tested on her biology, her presence lives. Henrietta's story is not just about injustice, it's about transformation, about how one woman's body, unwillingly given, has demanded a reckoning from the very field that once ignored her humanity. And maybe that's what legacy really is, not what you choose, but what you change. So the next time you hear the words informed consent, the next time you see a medical breakthrough, remember the woman behind the cells, the one who never stopped giving, even when no one asked her if she wanted to. Her name is Henrietta Lacks. She changed the world, and now the world must never forget her.